Welcome to Affordable Foundations, Legacy Impact Through Housing, the podcast that explores how housing shapes communities and creates lasting legacies. I'm your host, Cecilia Cossio, and each week we'll dive deep into solutions, challenges, and opportunities in affordable, attainable, and workforce housing. From current housing models to innovative approaches reshaping the industry, we'll explore the policies, investment strategies, and community-driven initiatives that are making a real impact. Housing isn't just about buildings, it's about people, opportunity, and the future we're creating together. We believe everyone plays an important role in affordable housing, whether you're a real estate investor, developer, policymaker, property manager, or someone passionate about creating positive change. Affordable Foundations is your go-to source for insights and inspiration. So let's break barriers, redefine possibilities, and build a legacy together. Welcome back to Affordable Foundations, Legacy Impact Through Housing. I'm your host, Cecilia Cossio, and today we're diving into a conversation that goes far beyond the surface. We hear the term diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI thrown around in so many industries, but what does it really mean in affordable housing? And more importantly, how do we ensure it's not just a buzzword, but a real actionable commitment to building stronger, more inclusive communities? Joining me today is someone who has dedicated her career to this very mission, Joanna Rodriguez. She has been at the forefront of advancing equitable housing solutions, ensuring that historically marginalized communities have not just access to housing, but a voice in shaping the spaces called home. When I speak to others about affordable housing, I tell them Joanna is a true expert in this field, and her passion runs deep. Let's start today by getting Joanna to introduce herself. Joanna, you have the mic.
Hi, Cecilia. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a guest on your podcast. I'm really excited. So I've been in affordable housing for about 30 years. I started off as a leasing agent in, believe it or not, Augusta, Georgia, in a military housing situation where I thought, well, I can do this job. And they gave me the job, but I got a free apartment. And so that's what the incentive was. You get a free apartment and you get to be a leasing agent. And so I started then, and from there I continued with the low-income housing tax credit programs, had no idea what that was. And then eventually I got married, had a child, and at the time I was living in senior housing, and they couldn't let me live with a child in senior housing. That was way before, where they were very strict on their age requirements when you lived in senior housing. And so I ended up going to work at a housing authority, at Plano Housing Authority in 2001, and have been in some sort of affordable housing since then.
Well, I'm grateful that you agreed to come on, and I want to get started. So I'm going to ask you, why do you think diversity, equity, and inclusion matters so much in the context of affordable housing?
Well, I think that for me, home, it's where it's at. You know, we talk about so many programs, but if you think about the concept of home is where you have birthday parties. Home is where your family is. Home is your memories. And for many, it can be a physical space. It could be the people that surround you. For me, I was a military brat, and our home was anywhere that our family was at. But we were never in a position where we didn't have access to a home or a physical space just because my father was in the military. Since I've started working in the affordable housing realm, I've noticed that for many, home is not that same feeling that I get. For a lot of people, there's hardship in home and keeping a home and maintaining a home and having a decent place to live. And so when I started really working in affordable housing, I didn't really understand the concept of what home outside of what I had grown up with meant. And so when we start talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think it's important that we use the words diversity, equity, and inclusion and not just DEI, because DEI right now in present day tense is just thrown around and it's sort of become a bad buzzword. But diversity, equity, and inclusion means accessibility. accessibility to all, accessibility regardless of gender, sexual orientation, race, national origin, accessibility regardless of disability, special needs. And in most cases, in my world, it also means regardless of economic disadvantages that you may experience. So for me, diversity, equity, and inclusion is important in housing because everyone needs a home. There's not one person in this entire world that doesn't need a home. I mean, so for me, diversity, equity, inclusion is important for the accessibility of housing for all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so important. Which brings us to the next question. Are there any specific barriers that you feel are faced that they face that we might not be thinking about?
Yes, tons of barriers. So first of all, we can talk about it from a person looking for housing. You know, we tend to look at housing as an economic barrier. And so I don't necessarily look at housing as an economic barrier because depending on what kind of income you have and where you live, that's going to determine the housing that you choose. For example, I'm not going to go to Hollywood Hills and look at a $5 million home because that's not a barrier for me. It just means that I'm not economically able to do that. And so I don't necessarily look at the economics of affordability, but what I do look at are the barriers in accessing housing that should be just for everyone. So when we look at apartments, for example, let's say a person makes $12, $13 an hour. $12 an hour is easy just because I know it off the top of my head. $25,000 a year. Think of your administrative assistants, your waitresses, your waiters, people that work in sort of our service industries. $12 an hour is not necessarily a bad wage considering our minimum wage is $7.25. Well, with $25,000 annually, of course, we have to take out taxes and that wonderful person called FICA that we all pay. But can you really afford a one-bedroom apartment in Dallas, for example, when you're talking about $1,500, $1,600 for a one-bedroom apartment? You really can't. So that's an economic barrier. But more so, there's a lack of affordable housing. And so when we talk about affordable housing, we have to not only define what is affordable housing. Affordable housing is not necessarily me wanting a $5 million mansion in Beverly Hills. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what can a person actually afford in their price range? Is there accessibility? Is there a housing stock? And then taking all those things into consideration, is there accessibility when we come to screening criteria? Is there accessibility when we come in maintaining those homes? And so we talk about all these things in conjunction with diversity, equity, and inclusion because the barriers do exist. We don't think about discrimination as something that happens in 2025, but it does. And so when we look at diversity, we look at the private housing landlord market, and we understand that there is discrimination that occurs, whether it's racial, whether it's disability, whether it's familial, whether it's religious in nature. There is barriers that occur there. But more importantly, what are your opportunities when the housing choices that you have to make based on economic barriers are limited? Are you limited to a certain area? Are you limited to a certain school system? Are you limited to areas that maybe have higher poverty, higher crime, because there is no affordability in other areas? So I look at all of those things when we're talking about equitable paths with housing going forward, because it's really important for our families to be able to have access to decent housing in all neighborhoods, in good school systems, in areas that don't have food deserts, in areas that you would feel safe raising your family.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this at great lengths, and we talk about the fact that, somebody that is paying, you said $25,000 a year, right? Let's double that. I'm seeing in the multifamily industry, average starting wage for site positions are $18, $20 an hour. All right, so let's just double the 25,000. Say it's 50,000 a year. Your average rent is $1,500 a month. You have to make 3 times that amount to qualify for an apartment. That means you annually have to make 54,000 a year. So, when we talk about affordable housing and we talk about the stigma that it has, the fact that some of our employees wouldn't qualify to live on a property where the average rent is $1,500 a month.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is real stuff. So we talk about the 80% rule, like somebody who qualifies under an 80% AMI. And for those listeners that don't know what that means, that means that if the income is 100,000 for an area, you got an somebody who qualifies under 80% would be an $80,000 annual salary. They would qualify to be on a program. Now, I say this, it depends what the programs are. I only say this so people can recognize that these programs are not just for a Section 8 voucher, what I see the stigma is attached to. There is so much need out there, and it's a large variable. And you talk about food deserts. Explain to our listeners what that means and why that's important.
Well, for example, in the neighborhood that I live in, I've got a Target, a Walmart, a Whole Foods, a Sprouts. I can go within a 1-mile radius and find fresh produce that's not overpriced with lots of variety. In the food desert areas that a lot of low-income neighborhoods are located in, and a lot of our affordable housing projects are located in, you'd have to go 5-10 miles before you actually found an actual grocery store. So what you have are usually convenience stores, gas stations, places that have overpriced groceries that are not always the most healthiest choices, and they don't have fresh produce. They might not have fresh meats, and so what you're looking at is overprocessed food, which then contributes to other issues. So food deserts are important to us when we look at affordable housing, because not only are you have this cycle of poverty because you're living in a place that necessarily has higher crime, more opportunities for you to actually have to spend more money. And I say that in, opportunities for you to have to spend more money. The reality of it is there is this thing where, if you don't have access to transportation, access to good quality healthcare, access to good food sources, all of that costs money that eats into what you would be using for housing costs. And so we, look at people's choices without understanding that the choices that they're making for housing is also the same choices that they're having to make for healthcare, for the quality of food that they eat, the childcare that they receive, the education that their children receive. All of these things kind of go together to create an environment in which they're not really set up for self-sufficiency and success. And so then we say, well, affordable housing doesn't work. People are on affordable housing for years and years and years. I think the average lifespan of a person on housing usually is 12 years. And we all in policy making opportunities, we say we want to limit housing to 5 years. Well, you can limit those housing choices, or when we talk about limiting housing choices, we're talking about the Section 8 voucher program or affordable housing programs that are subsidized. We want to put term limits on those housing programs. I'm not necessarily saying that I disagree, but what I'm saying is that it may not be as realistic as we think it is, because these families are making decisions based on the entire environment around them. And that includes living usually in high crime areas and areas that don't have great grocery stores, don't have great educational opportunities. And so housing impacts every aspect of a person's lives. It's not a one-off. It's not, oh, you solve this, you just provide an affordable house and everything is, fixes it. It's not that way at all.
Yeah. I think that is, all those are great points. And I thought it was important for you to share that, because I think sometimes we think, well, they get food stamps, or these are the things that I have heard and will hear, like they should be able to survive. Well, there's so much more involved with that. I had a property that had a convenience store right down the street from it. I think the closest grocery store was about 7 miles away. And this little convenience store had a lot of things happening there. But it also, the prices were like triple of everything else. And there was nothing healthy there. There was nothing healthy there. But sometimes that is the closest store where the mom can go or the dad can go walk to and grab whatever it is that they can feed their family for that evening. So I think all those points are very valid. And I thank you for sharing that, because we have to provide different experiences. We have to provide different solutions. It's not a one and done. And then say, well, this is a generational problem. It absolutely is. But we can also help people create generational wealth and find ways out of these situations by creating different experiences. How do you think that we as a community can partner up with the owners, the developers of the multifamily property management groups, as a community? What are some solutions that you have seen applied that work in these situations?
Well, that's interesting because what works here doesn't work there, and what works there doesn't work here.
Right.
And so when we have these national affordable housing conversations, we often get into, well, that's not going to work here. And in reality, it's more than likely the truth, because what I see working in California doesn't work in Texas,
Right.
May work in Colorado, doesn't work in South Texas, but might work in North Texas. I mean, Texas is a country all by itself. And so what I see is that there is no one solution that fits all. That we have to recognize that at the very beginning. And that my solution may be very community centric, may be very whole wellness centric. Another solution may be economic. Some solutions that I think are universal is regulations and barriers to developers who actually want to create affordable housing. So there's architectural barriers. For example, if you have a 3-story or higher building, I see a lot of conversation around exploring, do we really need 2 staircases? Because creating 2 staircases, which, we all believe will be safer, which in turn creates additional money that has to be spent in the community. And so what happens is it creates a barrier to creating more affordable housing. Zoning regulations. Now, as a homeowner, do I want a 500-unit apartment building next to me? Am I also contributing to that NIMBY attitude, which is my not in my backyard attitude? The reality of it is that we do, but we also want solutions. And so we can go through neighborhoods where perhaps an additional dwelling unit, should be zoned there. Or instead of zoning just for single family, maybe zone for duplexes, which, is a nice compromise between a 500-unit affordable housing building, but providing kind of those affordable housing solutions. We have so many elderly, like my parents, who have aged out of their 4 or 5 bedroom homes, who they just literally want a 2-bedroom home, but they don't want to live in an apartment community. They just want to live in a place that they have to do minimal maintenance. So when we talk about 0 lot homes, so there's lots of opportunities for additional rental type homes that can be subsidized. We look at manufactured homes. Manufactured homes of today are not the same as manufactured homes from the 70s. And so we tend to not want to look at those types of homes, tiny home communities. There's so many opportunities in what would work in your community, not my community, in your community. So that's the first thing. And then looking at eliminating as many barriers regulatory wise, because I can assure you that every regulation that we have just translates to money for developers. But then also being strategic about what regulations we do continue to keep on with. For example, right now, a lot of our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are being dismantled. The Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Program, some of the fair housing equitable regulations that we look at, because we also have to recognize inherently that in the history of our country, we can't get away from our history. We can't get away from the fact that redlining created segregated neighborhoods. We can't get away from the legacy of what we're now experiencing. And so when we talk about, well, why do all the African Americans live on the south side of Dallas? Well, traditionally, that's where they were able to purchase homes. So they created communities there. So if we look at our legacy, we look at our history, but also recognize that there are regulatory barriers for developers like you, Cecilia, to be able to build affordably. Right. Because if you're able to save money on building, then guess where those money savings usually translate into affordable developments. But also, I also see that in some communities that I work in, we try to regulate affordability. We try to say, you must do this. You must have 10 units of affordable housing in your luxury apartment community. Well, that doesn't always work either. And so developers push back against that. So we've got to look at common sense approach. I don't have the answer. I'll be honest with you. I don't have the answer because I see some things that work, and it really depends on who wants to make it work. Who wants to make it work? And then how it's administered and implemented. Because administration of it, I've seen some great affordable housing communities that have great management companies, that have great managers that are conscientious that they're part of a larger community, whose residents understand that they're part of a larger community. But then I also see other management companies that come in and developers that come in and owners that come in and they have deferred maintenance. They don't care about security. They don't care about the larger community, which gives us all a bad name in affordable housing. Mm-hmm. So it has to be, you have to look at our government, our counties, our city governments being able to provide affordability in the term of deregulation as much as possible. You have to look at the owners and the developers. They just want to make money. And as long as we understand that developers and owners want to make money, I think we're fine. But then you have to have a management company or an owner that actually cares about the people that live in their communities and provides a semblance of ownership, because people want to take pride in their homes. Mm-hmm. Simple things. You know, we talk about having ownership, but not, you know, in their front yard. If you have 20 apartment buildings and each building has a stairway that has 20 units, you're not going to care about your unit next door. But if your unit just has a nice little entrance and a little potted plant and you clean it every day, all of a sudden there's this pride in what you're doing.
Right.
And so it's simple things like that. But, you know, I know that this is a national conversation. Affordable housing is always at the forefront. But what I've learned in the past 25 years, there's not one size fits all. But what we do have to do is we just can't give up either, because affordable housing is going to be needed. It's not anything that's going to go away. People are always going to need homes. People are not always going to be able to keep up with the costs, the rising costs of home, whether it's construction costs, whether it's rental costs, whether it's buying new homes, whether it's even saving for home ownership, down payments. You know, home ownership is something that creates wealth. You talked a little bit earlier about creating wealth. Homeownership is one of those things that actually creates wealth. And it doesn't just create wealth for you, but it creates wealth in most cases for the people that come after you in your family. Yes. And so there's not one size fits all, but it's a conversation that just can't go away.
Absolutely. And you mentioned basically a camaraderie of different groups coming together and working together to make sure that things happen and things move in the direction that is considered more of a positive outcome than a negative one. And I think that when we talk about the different factors that happen out on those properties, the different things that happen out there, property management is key to any affordable property, because as you and I both know, if the management is not engaged, the residents are not engaged. Mm-hmm. And, you know, unfortunately, some of these properties are located in areas that are high crime areas. So it can be very cumbersome at times for them. They can get overwhelmed with some of the things that they have to deal with. But these are real life things that they deal with. They deal with the gangbanger, but they also deal with the graduate that lived there for the last 10 years and that they've seen grow from, you know, a baby to a young adult. And listen, it's real stuff. It's raw. But when you see these children that are walking through the property and they're engaging in sports or they're engaging with the community manager, it brings a different feeling to the heart, because we can talk about regulation and we can talk about everything that's around us. But the bottom line is those that live on those properties. Like whether it's a HUD property, a tax credit property, a senior property, a veteran property, a transitional property. They are here for a reason. And as property management, what are we doing to make sure that we engage and we take care of those that we serve? I think that is one of the most crucial pieces of this all, because property management does control, am I going to bring in a community advocate? Am I going to bring in the police? Am I going to have, when we bring the police in, are we bringing the police in to create positive experiences, or are they just coming here when it's, a situation? All of this is part of a bigger picture that I think sometimes us as developers, investors, owners, even the community doesn't really understand. They think they understand, but when you live on those properties and you work in those offices and you see the success of what affordable housing does, in the end, I just wish I could record all those successes, because we see all the unsuccessful situations, but there are many more successful stories, many more.
And that's one of the things that in property management, you can't do away with diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right.
You just can't, because in order for you to be successful on these properties, you have to be able to communicate. Let's really talk about what diversity, equity, and inclusion means. Diversity means if you are in a predominantly Hispanic community, you want a leasing agent or a community manager to be able to speak Spanish, or you want them to be able to speak Vietnamese, or you want them to be able to engage with the residents that actually live there. You want community managers that are able to engage with people of different generations. In particular, when you're talking about the multifamily that includes seniors and includes young people, because they all have to live together in this tightly dense space. So when you're looking at hiring practices, when you're looking at vendors that come in and interact with your residents, vendors that come in and interact with your teams, you are constantly looking at that. And then you're looking at your local community. And so when we talk about, for example, some of the programs that are going away that are DEI initiatives, that are HUD initiatives, we look at Section 3. We look at, and when I say Section 3, is hiring local people that might be minority and women-owned businesses, because you want those kids on those properties to be able to see a Cecilia and show, here is a Latina woman who is a developer who owns this building, who is providing housing. And now I, as a young Latina girl, can look at her and say, you know what? That's a possibility for me. Property management is one of the few, and I don't know if it's one of the few. It's just, this is my world. So I'm going to take the liberty of saying it's one of the few places. You don't have to have a college degree to make $150,000 a year. Right. You can literally start off as a leasing agent, as a front desk clerk, and work your way up to a regional, a portfolio supervisor. There are so many opportunities in property management. There are trades. We tend to emphasize college for all of our kids, and that's a wonderful thing. But not all kids are going to college. And those that want to go to college, great. They can go to college, and then they can be the business owner of an HVAC company, of a plumbing company, of a tile company. And so property management encompasses all those things. And that's why I think diversity, equity, and inclusion in property management is so important in the affordable housing industry as well, is because it's one of the places where you get to see a cross-section of everybody.
Yeah.
But it's very community-oriented. So providing language accessibility. How do you help people comply? Let's just talk about risk and liability, because at the end of the day, it's about, your NOI, your return of investment, right? So risk and liability. If I want someone who does not speak English and who happens to live in my community, why would I not provide accessible language to them? Whether it's in a form of a lease or a form of a house rules, so that they can understand this is what it means living in this community. Why would I not provide accessibility to individuals that have special needs or disabilities, whether there's mobility impairment, cognitive impairment, in order for them to be able to live successfully in your community? The more people that live successfully in affordable housing, These are your neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
You want good neighbors. How do you help people become good neighbors? And so we make the assumption that everybody is the same. We're not the same. And diversity, equity, and inclusion not only recognizes that we're not the same, celebrates that we're not the same, but also assists us to be able to live together. And so I think the conversation of affordable housing and diversity, equity, and inclusion go hand in hand. And it's important because it actually, at the end of the day, creates an environment on your properties that makes it safer.
Yeah.
Creates an environment on your property where people are taking care of the property. Creates an environment in your community where your neighbors may or may not even know that you're affordable housing. And so it's important for future housing that we continue in this conversation.
100% agree. My next question for you was going to be, what have you seen, what type of impact have you seen when you have diverse voices at the table versus not having diverse voices at the table?
Well, on the property level, compliance from residents. Let's start with that.
Mm-hmm.
Better, safer communities. Easier to manage when people understand.
Yeah.
But on a broader scale, because I'm no longer on the front lines of property management as I was when I first started.
Mm-hmm.
Now what I see is just being able to have those conversations at a higher level, on a policy level, being able to see people like you, for example, that can make choices to kind of end discrimination in certain cases, but also in wealth building, in creating opportunities for other Latinas, for other women developers. I was reading when you and I talked a couple weeks ago or a couple days ago, I was reading about, I did in ChatGPT, how many women developers are there? There's 18% is what I found out. 18% of women developers. Now, having Latina developers is a little bit different because they can't drill down to that. But what I found interesting was that even though there weren't Latina developers, there were Latina construction contractors.
Yeah.
So hire construction contractors. But what does that really mean? It means in most cases that 51% of the women, it's a 51% owned women business, and it's a man that owns the rest of it, right? But they wanted to do that little check mark box. But what I've seen is that by having people at the table, design is different.
Yeah.
The design of homes becomes different. We look at, how do you actually flow through a home? How do you flow through a neighborhood? How do you create security, safety features, those long hallways with blind corners? A woman designing it designs differently, right?
Yeah.
You look at accessibility, for example, when you have someone that's in a wheelchair, they're thinking very differently than how you and I walk through our homes, right? And even like with my husband, he's really tall. I now look at ceiling heights and the measurement of the ceiling fans. All of these things bring different perspectives, and that's what you get with diversity and equity and inclusion. You get these different perspectives that results in different design plans, in different ways that you actually approach the table. And so I think that that's what's important when we talk about what I've seen in design, is just that the more voices that are different, they bring a different element to it, things that you would never think about.
Yeah.
Just because, I do a lot of inspections. If you and I were to do an inspection, you would see something completely different than I. I walk in looking down, you walk in looking up.
Yeah.
We're not wrong. We're just looking at different things.
Yeah. No, we are. When I speak to people about developing and we start talking about what is this going to look like? What is the cost going to be? What are we going to build? Or what checkbox do we have to check for the application to be submitted? And I bring this up all the time where I say, like, a lot of these children don't have dressers, right? They don't have a place to put their clothes. So when you you walk into a home to do an inspection and you see stuff in baskets, you can tell like if there's an issue there of cleanliness or tidiness, and or if an apartment's dirty, like, because there are certain requirements that the residents are required to keep. And again, that's a property management function to ensure that that is happening, being followed through on. But I say, why not build cubby holes? Why not build drawers? I would like to go as far as building bed frames that are actually built into the units, because, again, a bedroom set is not normal on some of these lower income properties. It's not the same in every area, like you said, but, I wouldn't do that on my senior property, but I would do it on my, family property. And so like, there's some things to think about. If we want to break these cycles and provide different experiences, we need to put some money into those areas as well. I know that my granite countertops is going to create more value for the asset. As an investor and an owner, that's where I want my money to go. But as somebody who deals with affordable housing, I also know that if I want to be part of the solution, I have to think about those other things that matter and that teach these families, like, this is how you handle this part. This is how you handle that part. Giving financial education as part of what, they need, just like the housekeeping inspections or videos that they have to watch. We should have them watch videos on financial education and give those programs. I feel very strongly about that, and I see the impact it makes when people get involved at that level. So,
I agree.
as
doors on closets. Yeah. Doors on closets.
Yes.
Doors on closets. Little things like that. I 100% agree. I walk into some bathrooms that have been recently designed in some of my communities, and they're pedestal sinks. I would never put a pedestal sink unless it's my third bathroom or half bath.
Yeah.
Where are you going to put your curling iron and all the other things that, your toothbrush? And then we wonder why things, are not taken care of as well. Storage. I go into some of my homeless communities, that are for formerly homeless individuals. And one of the things that just saddened me tremendously was I walked in, and the gentleman that lived there actually had his tent pitched in the middle of the living room. And that's where he lived. And, it was a nice studio apartment and everything. But he told me, he says, I feel comfortable right here. He goes, this is nice, but I feel comfortable in my tent. And so he just had pitched his tent inside of the living room. So this is people's homes. These are people's homes. And so, like I said, it's not a one size fits all approach, but we've seen a lot. I can't tell you how many homes I've been in, and what I have found, in particular with my PHA partners and, developers who are receiving grant funding or subsidy funding and are being driven by the HUD mission of, furthering affirmative fair housing marketing, their designs are becoming very thoughtful. You can walk into an affordable housing community and they'll have a library nook. Remember before we all had computer places, right?
Yeah.
Computer places are obsolete now.
Yeah.
But what's not obsolete? An area where they can actually bathe their pets and have pet parks. Things that we would normally consider luxury items, but these are just everyday items that people use. And they make, when you walk into a community that has taken consideration and care to do something like that for their residents, the residents notice and they want to upkeep it. Yeah. At one of my properties in Louisiana that was my first development property, actually, we put Ring cameras on every single door. All of a sudden, that resident felt empowered for their own security. It was no longer the property management's responsibility that all these things were happening around their community. All of a sudden, they became empowered because they could see. And so it was just it was just a shifting of a mindset. And so there's a lot of good things happening in affordable housing. There's not enough good things happening, but there's a lot of good things happening. And I'm always encouraged when I go out to do my site visits and just see all of the new properties that are coming out and, how spacious they are and how much they provide dignity to the family that's actually going to move in.
That right there. Dignity to the family that's going to move in. And giving them a roadmap on how can we move you to the next level. This doesn't happen overnight, but how do we create a roadmap to ensure that they start learning that? Why would you not want to be the one to help them create this roadmap to financial success? Financial success means a lot of different things to people. To somebody who is a professional making a six-figure salary, you may not understand that financial success to somebody who is on an affordable property is actually being able just to buy their own home or move from an apartment into a rental home or a duplex, like you said, creating spaces that can be fitting to more than the traditional. Get the apartment building. I really do. I'm an investor. I get all of it and I get the regulation, but I think when we think about affordable housing, we really have to be open to all these different ideas and bringing in people like you, Joanne, who have experienced multiple. I'm sure, I know the number of assets that I've overseen, so I can imagine what you have done. And I think the examples you provide and the passion you have for these families and creating spaces where they are able to live with dignity. That is key. And that's more empowering to them than anything else. You want to see people move into another level where they can provide for their family and come off these programs, be part of the solution. And look, if we had the answer of what that solution was as a whole, we'd probably be, sitting on a beach, living off of that right now, right? Like I wish we did have the solution. Well, I don't know that I could really live on a beach, I could go to the beach, but, but my point to that is that it takes everybody. And what you try here, will, like you said, won't work over there, but you have to keep trying. We can't give up.
And affordable housing, the need for affordable housing won't ever go away because, we're getting older.
Yeah.
We have children. Our children will have children. The need for affordable housing does not go away because not everyone's going to be at the same income level. Not everyone's going to make the best choices. And then there is the economics of just poverty.
Yeah.
Rising costs. We used to say, when I worked at the Housing Authority, everyone's a paycheck away from homelessness. Everyone's a paycheck away from eviction. We saw that during the COVID pandemic. We saw how much, not being able to work your restaurant job or not being able to go to work your grocery job, how that impacted the financial market with affordable housing. The government intervened. This is not a space to decide whether it was right or wrong how the government intervened, because I definitely have ideas about how some things were wrong and some things were right. But we saw how important affordable housing was and will continue to be. So affordable housing doesn't go away. The need for affordable housing doesn't go away. The clients that we serve in affordable housing, we can, there's a cycle of some become self-sufficient, but then some come back to affordable housing. The elderly that we serve, the special needs population that we serve that really will never be self-sufficient. And they've worked all their lives either in lower paying jobs or, a medical crisis has impacted that family. And so we see a lot of that. A lot of my communities now that I go and visit are communities that have been impacted by the drug crisis, the opiate crisis, elderly communities, and, communities that serve the disabled, communities that serve veterans.
Yeah.
They're not able to necessarily have, we all want everyone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and pay full rent and all that. But the reality of it is that will never be a reality. And I think we have to recognize that as well. And so as our society, where are we going to put what are we going to invest in? Is this a worthwhile investment? Is it a worthwhile investment for my neighbor to be able to live with dignity? For me, it is. And that's the question that we have to ask ourselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that it comes to having heart in this as well. I did an interview and we think with our pocketbook, and I get it, it again on both sides, but we have to remember that we we are and can be susceptible to the same challenges. I think also we see families, multi-generational in one home. And we're not just talking about the, older generation. We're also talking about the younger one who went off to college but can't afford to live out on their own. So they come home to live with mom and dad. And then you have 2 to 3 different generations living in a home. And sometimes, especially on these affordable housing sites, it is necessary. And when we talk about affordable housing, Joanna, I want to be clear that I'm not just talking about those that have programs. I'm also talking about the assets out there that don't qualify to be on any programs, or the owners didn't, sign up for any programs. But the people who live on those properties are making 25,000, 40,000, 50,000, 60,000. The moms with 2 kids, a teacher who's making 65,000 a year with 2 children. Like, you're talking about an apartment that's $1,800. And we're not even talking about utilities, water, sewer, or any of those other things, right? And I say this not to make the landlords look bad. I'm a landlord. My insurance, my taxes continue to go up. The regulations that impede us from really doing some of the things that we'd like to do get in the way. That's costly. So this is like one big circle of things that we all have to engage in and be involved in. And again, it's about education and understanding the different properties, the different programs, the different assets. It's about diversification in many ways.
And it's like, and even in like my neighborhood, in my neighborhood, you can't rent out rooms. But then you think about it, we're kind of from the same generation. Remember that great show, Golden Girls?
Yeah.
They were suffering from an affordable housing crisis. That's how all of them ended up living together. That would not work in my neighborhood because of regulations that prohibits them from renting a home to each other.
Yeah.
And so you think about that. So the narrative needs to change as well, because, the reality of it is right now the narrative with diversity, equity, and inclusion is just bad.
Yeah.
We know it. You can't say it. You can't talk about it. Just off with your heads when we're talking about DEI. But you think about the affordable housing crisis. The Golden Girls were victims of the affordable housing. But our regulations in my neighborhood would literally prohibit that situation, which makes perfect sense. I mean, if I lived in a 5-bedroom house, why can't I rent a room to somebody that's not related to me?
Right.
And still continue living in my home.
Yeah.
So the affordable housing crisis, we need to change the narrative. It's not a Black issue. It's not a brown issue. It's not an immigrant issue. It is literally an economic issue. It's an elderly issue. It's an issue that impacts every single family. Right now, the LA fires, devastating. There's a lot of people right now that don't have homes. Insurance, you mentioned insurance earlier. Insurance is a major barrier right now to developers to be able to build more affordable housing. I probably could not be a developer with a $100,000 deductible on insurance per incident. All of these things impact the affordability of affordable housing and what we're able to build, what we're able to provide, knowing that there's still a need.
Yeah. I think our conversation can go on and on and on, and it does for those of you listening. We do get,
I've never talked to you before ever, Cecilia.
Well, Joanne, before we go, for listeners who want to get involved in supporting these efforts in affordable housing, what advice or first steps can they take to make a difference?
Look around their neighborhoods. Affordable housing is such a local conversation. Become informed about the national conversation. Go to HUD.gov, go to, all sorts of different resources, listen to your podcast, obviously. But then the impact that you can make is at the local level. NIMBYism is a really, really, really real thing. Not in my backyard. So we tend to say, oh, we don't want homeless people. We don't want homeless veterans. But you don't want them living next to you either. So be honest about the conversations that you're having, but become involved locally. And know where your city stands on housing. Know what is affordable in your community. And then if you live in one of those affordable communities, become active and vocal. That's the one thing. Every single person that lives in our communities, in our affordable housing communities, every Section 8 voucher holder, every person that lives on a low-income housing tax credit community, guess what? Their vote is the same as anybody else's vote, regardless of how much income they make. Whether they're a homeowner, whether they're a renter, this is their community. And we tend to think of renters as people that just come in and out and come in and out. I can tell you that I know more long-term renters that could have paid 2 or 3 mortgages at some of our properties, for many, many years.
Mm-hmm.
And so we tend to dismiss renters as people who are part of the community, but they are part of the community. And so I always tell all of my renters when I was on property management, why are you not voting? Why are you not going to, your local town hall meetings? Why are you not writing your representative? Why are you not going to City Hall? You have the same vote that I have.
Absolutely.
And when people get to hear from renters, especially on the larger pockets of our communities, it becomes a great thing because then they feel empowered.
Yeah. You made that comment. I don't know if you remember this. It was, at least 8 years ago, 10, it's a long time. And we were holding a function and you reminded everybody, start at the local level, start somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I have stuck to that. I share that all the time. So, start locally, start where you're at. And yes, go from there, but do something, take action.
And don't feed into the stereotypes.
Absolutely.
Don't feed into the stereotypes. Regardless of whose administration is in power at our national level, regardless of who your local administration is, these are your neighbors. These are your neighbors. You wouldn't turn your back on someone because of who they voted for or what their politics are. These are your neighbors, and you're all living in the same space. And so just remember who we are.
Amen to that. Well, thank you again, Joanne, for sharing your expertise and passion. And to everyone tuning in, thank you for being part of this critical conversation. If you found today's episode valuable, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we can shape a future where affordable housing truly serves everyone. Until next time, this is Cecilia Cossio, and you've been listening to Affordable Foundations, Legacy Impact Through Housing.
That's a wrap on this episode of Affordable Foundations, Legacy Impact Through Housing. I hope today's conversation sparked new ideas and gave you a fresh perspective on the role we all play in creating sustainable, thriving communities. Affordable housing isn't just about buildings. It's about people, opportunity, and the legacies we leave behind. Every step we take to improve access, challenge stigmas, and drive solutions brings us closer to a future where everyone has a place to call home. Make sure to subscribe to Affordable Foundations on your favorite podcast platform and share this episode with others who are just as passionate about making a difference. Follow us on social media for more insights, updates, and stories from the field. And before we go, a special shout out to the incredible teams working on the front lines of our multifamily properties. The property managers, maintenance teams, leasing staff, and all those who make housing possible every day. Your work is the foundation of stronger communities, and we see you. We appreciate you, and we thank you. Until next time, let's keep building a legacy that lasts.